Boris Johnson is the most popular candidate by far.
Boris Johnson is unsuitable to be Prime Minister of this country.
He is the candidate that will revive the Conservative Party, unite the country.
Boris is refusing to do any head-to-head debates.
Boris Johnson thinks that there are questions that he simply does not have to answer.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we're covering this week. The British Prime Minister in waiting, Boris Johnson, a reporter turned politician who is now running circles around journalists.
Boris, he lives next door.
And has made this neighbor of his hip-hopping mad. Donald Trump and the rape allegation given short shrift by American news outlets. And Iran just ain't what it used to be. The Persian TV channels, based overseas, that traffic in nostalgia. Boris Johnson, the odds-on favorite to become Britain's next prime minister, had one distinct advantage going into the race to succeed Theresa May: name recognition. When the UK media drop that name, Boris, Britons know exactly who they're talking about. As it happens, the news business is where Johnson got his start, where his troublesome relationship with the facts first surfaced. Back in the late 1980s, after getting fired from his first reporting job for inventing a quote, Johnson wound up as a correspondent in Brussels, where he produced a slew of flimsy Eurosceptic stories that readers found amusing, stories that could well have sowed seeds in people's minds for an eventual Brexit. Fast forward 30-odd years, and there was Johnson, a key asset on the Leave side in the 2016 referendum campaign, saying the same kinds of things about the EU as a politician that he once did as a journalist. These days, the British media finally seem to have clued into the fact that entertainment value isn't everything, that Boris Johnson falls dangerously short of the qualifications for the job. But he already has one foot in the door of 10 Downing Street, so this media awakening is looking like too little, too late. Our starting point this week is London. We live in populist times. In 2016, Americans elected a former reality TV star, a triumph of sound bites over substance, to the White House.
You're fired.
Una grande passione per questo teatro.
Last year, Italians voted a party formed by a comedian, Beppe Grillo, into a coalition government. 2 months ago, Ukrainians elected another comedian, Volodymyr Zelensky, president, in a landslide. Where does Britain's Boris Johnson fit in? He's part entertainer like Donald Trump, part comedic sideshow like Grillo and Zelensky. Or, as one British columnist put it, Johnson is a character, which lets him get away with things a serious politician wouldn't. Mr. Johnson's unseriousness, in short, is his most effective political weapon. And that's a pro-Johnson voice writing in a paper that wants him to be Prime Minister.
Boris Johnson comes across as a sort of amiable buffoon in a long tradition of upper-middle-class British characters. It's not really what he's like at all. He's ruthlessly ambitious. The idea that Boris Johnson gets up in the morning, looks in the mirror and says, "What can I do for the common man today?" is palpable nonsense. He is concerned only with his own advancement.
He is a huge opportunist, but he also has engaged in really, really toxic forms of politics. Legislation that is detrimental to marginalised people in Britain, so harsher laws for asylum seekers, harsher laws for immigrants, and that is overlooked in favour of thinking about him as this character of fun.
We in Britain, we're facing exactly the same problems that the American press is facing with Trump, which is, how do you hold a liar to account? And in this day and age, it's incredibly difficult because our media is very largely owned by oligarchs, and they're overwhelmingly right-wing. And you can see concerted elements of the press working together to promote their man, which is Boris Johnson.
Beautiful day.
Johnson is well aware that most of the UK print media do have his back, but not all of them. And when The Guardian broke a story this past week that a neighbor of Johnson's overheard a domestic argument between him and his girlfriend and was concerned enough to call the police, Johnson's carefully calibrated, amiable buffoon act was put to the test on the airwaves.
Can you just tell us what happened at your partner's home a couple of nights ago?
Police were called to your house in the early hours of Friday morning.
Papers will print whatever they're going to print.
That story dominated coverage of Johnson this past week at the expense of another significant expose. Last year, reports emerged that Johnson was being advised by Steve Bannon, the alt-right former White House operative who has ties to white supremacists. Bannon was reportedly behind President Trump's efforts to ban Muslims from entering the U.S. Johnson repeatedly denied that he and Bannon were working together. But just last week, this video of Bannon came out, shot in July of last year.
It'll be at Commons. He's going to give a speech in Commons today that's going to throw down. He just went back to the Daily Telegraph as a columnist. I've been talking to him all weekend about this speech.
Carol Cadwalader broke that story in The Observer. Isabel Oakeshott is a former political editor at The Times, a paper that has employed Johnson. They see this story in distinctly different ways.
You know, I email Boris Johnson's press advisor to get a comment. And first of all, he says that it's just not true. And then I said, well, you know, we've got video of Bannon saying otherwise. And then he said, oh, I'll come back to you. And instead he came back to me and said, oh, it's just all a ridiculous conspiracy. They dropped the denial.
I think this is all nonsense. I don't think Boris has a particularly close relationship with Steve Bannon. Boris knows all sorts of people, and I'm sure he's taking and listening to advice from a wide variety of characters, some more reputable than others. But it doesn't mean that there's some kind of conspiracy cooked up here to take world politics lurching to the right.
Perhaps not, but less than a month after Bannon made those comments about working with Johnson, mentioning the Daily Telegraph, this appeared in the paper, a column written by Johnson, Trumpian in tone and content, saying that Muslim women who wear the niqab look like letterboxes and bank robbers.
We don't know all the specifics of the relationship between Boris Johnson and Steve Bannon, but in another way, it doesn't matter. What matters is that he is trading on exactly the same kind of politics that Steve Bannon is. Boris Johnson likes to ramp up the hatred towards certain groups of people at particular times, and at this moment, that is ramping up hatred towards Muslims, which is an existing sentiment in Britain.
The Daily Telegraph and Boris Johnson have a relationship that goes back decades, one that has had an impact on British journalism and politics. Johnson made his name as the paper's Brussels correspondent from 1989 to 94. There, he hit on a formula, filing stories on the arcane bureaucracy of the EU, pointless regulations that supposedly mandated the size of bananas and condoms, or threatened to make some of Britain's favorite snack foods illegal. That the stories bore little relationship to the truth was of no apparent concern to Johnson or the paper employing him. Johnson's reporting helped set the tone for the way the EU was seen in the UK and eventually for the Brexit referendum of 2016.
What Boris Johnson's Eurosceptic journalism did was stoke the simmering Euroscepticism within the Conservative Party. But possibly more important, it set the tone for 25 years of British media coverage of Europe. Because every news editor in Fleet Street thought that what Boris Johnson was producing was much more interesting than the usual grey, dull fare that came out of Brussels, and they demanded the same. I know this because I was a Brussels correspondent for 3 years myself at the end of the 1990s. So come the referendum, you know, the referendum wasn't lost in those 5 weeks, whatever it was, in June 2016. It had been lost over the previous 25 years.
Can we blame Boris Johnson for Britain's fundamental Euroscepticism, tracing that back to a couple of decades ago almost, when Boris was churning out these ludicrous stories, exaggerated stories? It was immensely colourful, made great copy, and people lapped it up. But I'm sure also people took it with a little bit of a pinch of salt.
Boris Johnson's ongoing relationship with the Telegraph remains central to his political ambitions. Because the current Prime Minister, Theresa May, resigned before her term was up, her successor will be selected on July 23rd, not in a general election, but by the Conservative Party membership. And until then, the Telegraph will continue to provide Boris Johnson with a weekly platform, a direct pipeline to the 160,000 Conservative Party faithful who will choose Britain's next Prime Minister.
The Daily Telegraph is the Bible of the Conservative Party, and our next Prime Minister is being chosen not by the British public, but by the 0.25% of the electorate who happen to be Tory party members. So his column in the Daily Telegraph is immensely important to him. I think it's quite extraordinary. To me, it breaches every code of journalistic ethics. I cannot understand how he or the Telegraph gets away with it.
If the politician and the paper do get away with it, it will be because the line between politics and the press in the UK, between those elected and those supposedly holding them to account, has long been blurred by mutual self-interest. Boris Johnson is just the latest beneficiary of that. And if the polls, prognosticators, and bookmakers have got it right, he'll ride that relationship all the way to 10 Downing Street. We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Flo Phillips. Flo, we're still almost a year and a half away from the U.S. presidential elections in 2020, but the campaigns are up and running. There were those 2 televised debates on the Democratic Party side this past week, but the coverage seems to be overshadowed by coverage of President Trump, which once again seems to be falling short in the U.S. news media.
Yes, Richard, that very same US media, same networks, same papers that have done a lot of self-examination about mistakes they made, mistakes that could well have played a part in Trump's 2016 victory. Now, 2 years into his presidency, it seems that much of the media is still struggling with how to deal with him. Take this past week, no shortage of potentially explosive material over which to question him. Lots and lots of stories about the inhumane conditions at those detention centres down on the border with Mexico. And yet, when Trump sat down for an interview with NBC's Chuck Todd on Meet the Press, Todd let him get away with some blatant lies.
But I ended separation. I inherited separation from President Obama.
Now, Trump has said that before, blaming President Obama for those family separation policies. But he's been knocked down. Not only did Todd let him get away with that, but the Meet the Press Twitter account later posted a tweet echoing Trump's lie, before eventually posting a second tweet noting that Trump's claim is false. And all that from a programme that used to be one of the hardest-hitting political interview shows on the American airwaves.
Usually, Trump attracts saturation levels of news coverage. When that doesn't happen, it's actually noticeable. And there was one such case this past week where the follow-on coverage of an allegation didn't really hit the mark.
Far from it, Richard. Just over a week ago, the advice columnist E. Jean Carroll published an extract in New York Magazine, an extract from her upcoming book. In it, she accuses President Trump of raping her. She says that he attacked her in the dressing room of a department store back in the 1990s. Now, that's front-page news for most people, not, it seems, for many of the top newspaper editors. The only one that gave it top billing was The Washington Post. The New York Times ran the story in its book section, treating it as a story about an upcoming memoir and not a rape allegation against a sitting president. On the TV side, Carroll did appear on MSNBC, but none of the major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, devoted more than a passing reference to the story. Brian Stelter, who's the host of Reliable Sources, the media analysis show on CNN, started to theorise about media fatigue. Fatigue, that is, about now more than 20 allegations of Trump's harassment and sexual abuse of women. If media are fatigued now, what kind of hope do we have for the coverage that we're going to get down the road? We are still almost 18 months from these elections.
OK, thanks, Flo. The latest stare-down between Washington and Tehran over Iran's shooting down of that U.S. drone made for plenty of scary headlines. The threats of military retaliation from President Trump eventually came to nothing. But this is a situation that is being closely followed by oppositional Iranian groups, including Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former Shah of Iran. The prince has recently offered many an exclusive interview to Western news outlets, presenting himself as a credible democratic successor to Iran's Islamic leadership. That is debatable, given that the prince's father ran an authoritarian regime protected by a brutal force of secret police until he was toppled in 1979. However, the monarchy remains popular in large segments of the Iranian media diaspora. Channels like the UK-based Manoto TV, BBC Persian, the Istanbul-based Gem TV, and Tepesh TV, which comes out of Los Angeles. Those channels have pioneered a genre of programming you might call nostalgia TV, documentaries and entertainment shows that skate right past the repression of the Shah's reign and focus on the social freedoms of those times. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the Iranian media diaspora, its penchant for nostalgia, and the rose tinting of Iran's pre-revolutionary history.
Every Friday night, Manoto TV, a Persian-language satellite channel based in London, invites viewers to turn back the clock.
سلام به تونل زمان خوش اومدید.
Tunel Zaman, or Time Tunnel, delivers a feast of archival footage, showcasing life in Iran under its last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. What viewers see is a vision of a liberal and stylish Iran, led by a benevolent king. It's enough to make you wonder why the 1979 revolution and the overthrow of the Shah ever happened.
You see women out and about on the beach, on university campuses, in the workplace, participating in sports, images of the Shah and his wife. His third wife, usually the Empress Farah, always looking very beautiful, looking very glamorous. The idea is, look at how beautiful and happy and fashionable everybody was in the past, unlike how we are now.
I found it quite extraordinary when I visited Iran a few years ago to find out that almost every person in Iran was familiar with Manoto. What guaranteed the channel's success was their access to Iranian archive footage from the period before the revolution.
قسمت رو با فیلم کوتاهی از باغ کاخ نیاوران سال 1349 شروع کنیم که بسیار دیدنی است و برای اولین بارم است که پخش میشه.
Manoto started its broadcast for audiences inside Iran to provide them with entertainment and news that they would otherwise not receive. Certainly all the channels inside Iran are censored, certain topics are taboo. Manoto provided those topics, such as monarchy, which has been the biggest taboo.
When Manoto launched in 2010, it entered an already crowded market, Iranian media outlets broadcasting in exile. The first wave of Iranian emigration took place in the lead-up to the 1979 revolution. Mass protests against the Shah, his oppressive government, and his brutal secret police, the Savak, would bring him down. The popular uprising eventually coalesced behind the country's new leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, and in 1979, the Islamic Republic was born. Many Iranian immigrants ended up in Los Angeles, which became a hub for Persian media production in the 80s. After that, wherever Iranians were migrating to, new media outlets were taking root.
The exile TV of the 80s was very raw, it was very immediate, so they were appealing to a nostalgia of literally yesterday, or just last year, a few years ago. And they were also appealing to the sense of loss and unrootedness that folks were feeling as new exiles. Their programming was mostly music and films, and then some politics. When satellite technology emerged and there was a possibility to broadcast into Iran, you saw then a shift and more of an emphasis on political content and calls for action and calls for even revolution.
The channels that come out of Los Angeles, the diaspora channels, are overtly political, clearly very anti-Islamic Republic in terms of their output. Many of them are monarchists, certainly very nationalist, and they're so political in actual fact, it's so obvious where their direction is that I think their impact is probably lessened by it.
ایرانی که 39 سال گرفتار شده و خوشبختانه ملت به پا خواسته ایران تصمیم گرفتن که این مسیر رو عوض بکنن.
Those channels that have a less clear political agenda and really have a more of an entertainment agenda, I think they have greater traction in Iran.
After LA came Gem TV in Istanbul and Farsi One in Dubai.
These channels added Turkish and Mexican soap operas, dubbed often poorly into Persian, to the mix. Then came Manoto out of London. Manoto's stock in trade is entertainment, laced with nostalgia. Politics isn't absent from its programming. It's less ham-fisted, glossier.
They produced a very influential documentary on the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, Reza Shah. It's a largely sanitized reading of The Reign, it has to be said.
و رضا خان به این ترتیب موفق به استقرار یکپارچگی و بازگرداندن امنیت به میهنش شد.
And it's very rosy, it's very positive. They're obviously producing an agenda, but it's done in a quite subtle way. It's not so overt as to put people off immediately.
او مردی مقید و پایبند اخلاق بود. زندگی خانوادگی برایش بیشتر اهمیت داشت. وعده‌های غذایی‌اش را تقریباً همیشه در کنار بچه‌هایش می‌خورد.
نسل جدیدی که امروز مثلا 20 سالشه.
The younger generation have this impression that before the revolution there was no poverty in Iran. And certainly Manoto would not discuss the Savak torture or the censorship of cinema, newspapers and the parliament. Just as the Iranian government selectively chooses footage to create a very negative image of that time, Manoto cherry-picks glorious and beautiful archives that do not provide a true picture of historical reality to viewers.
According to some who run diaspora media outlets, like Nazanin Ansari, the managing editor of the Kayhan London website, pro-monarchy output is fulfilling a real audience demand.
For us in Kayhan London, every single time that we put anything to do with monarchy, with Reza Shah, with Mohammad Reza Shah, with Reza Pahlavi, the clicks go up high. There is a demand. It's not as if we are providing them with a sanitized version. People want it because they look back at history and they see in those days they were a proud nation.
The source of Manoto's funding is a mystery, and the channel itself won't talk about its large budget. The unanswered questions have spawned numerous theories that the CIA, the BBC, the Saudi government, the Pahlavi family, or the Islamic Republic itself are all possible backers of the channel. We wrote to Manoto requesting an interview regarding its finances and programming. They wrote back saying they have a strict policy of not speaking with other media outlets.
This is one thing that journalists zoom on. Where does Manoto get its funding? For us, Kayhan London, a lot of Iranians provide us with funds, but they don't want their names to be known. Manoto as well. And certainly, if you come and ask me who are my funders, I will not tell you. It's a very tough market. And why should Manoto tell people which Iranians are funding it?
The Trump administration has been tightening the screws on Iran, unilaterally exiting the nuclear deal agreed to by more than 30 countries, upping economic sanctions, and ratcheting up the rhetoric.
Iran's leaders sow chaos, death, and destruction.
Monarchists, and there are many more outside Iran than inside, sense that now is a time of opportunity. The US-based Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, son of the Shah, clearly agrees. He's been making himself available for profile pieces in the Western press, interviews on the US government-sponsored Radio Farda that broadcasts in Persian into Iran and adding to the output of all those diaspora TV outlets. And as US pressure, the sanctions and the threats squeezes the Islamic Republic, the autocratic tendencies of the country's rulers is only helping make the case for some kind of alternative.
This nostalgia has been generated by the Islamic Republic itself rather than basically creating a new generation that detests the pre-revolutionary period. They've actually produced a new generation that are much more interested in what that period was about. Now, part of this, to be honest, is because even the worst aspects of the Shah, when it came to political repression, for instance, has been multiplied several times over by the Islamic Republic. What people are producing is popular history for the masses. It's not necessarily good history, I have to tell you, but it's popular history. It's going out and people are lapping it up.
Finally, back to Boris Johnson and that fight he had with his girlfriend last week that caused such a stir. Hearing the commotion, one of his neighbors, who happens to be a rapper called Too Many T's, headed outside to see what all the fuss was about. and ended up getting swarmed by paparazzi. He decided it was the perfect moment to offer up a little rap that he'd been working on called Boris Next Door. Now, Too Many T's promised the press pack there that a full version of his Boris rap was coming, so we got in touch and landed ourselves a world exclusive. We'll leave you now with a slice of Boris Next Door, and we'll see you next time here at the Listening Audience.
Boris, he lives next door with his big floppy hair and his ever flapping jaw. Boris, he lives next door. There's a bike outside, but his money's offshore. Boris, he lives next door. I asked for some sugar, but he said I'm too poor. Boris might come knocking on my door, but Boris Johnson was never meant to be let loose on the human kind. I was heading to a festival and getting in my car when I saw a load of guys must be waiting for a star. There was cameras in the hand, and mama must have made it large, cause the paparazzi's here, but those flashes didn't start. And a blonde hair, backpack, crap bike, typecast, Boris Johnson's moved in right next to my gap. King of eating mumble rap and likes to down a pint with that goofy charm and wit, Tim, nice but dim vibes. Well, that's what it seems. I mean, I need to get to know him. Invite him round for dinner, see what really gets him going. I'll do a Sunday roast, that's a national dish. Then I'll ask a few cues and do a factual fish. Like, how did he get to 350 mil a week? Is his calculator broke or is his maths just weak? And why does he change his mind seemingly at random? Like, 1 year pro-EU, the next to Brexit hard man. And why is he friends with that fascist Steve Bannon? Or think it's okay to say women wearing burqas look like letterboxers? Or use his Telegraph column to cast doubt on climate change? But he's